Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one it is about the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, where they've managed to advance both northeast and northwest of their current positions. The Ukrainians over the last 24 hours went to occupy Snagost here to the west of the village chain which the Ukrainians previously occupied, and they have moved in the direction of Korenevo. According to a multitude of reports, the Ukrainians have actually managed to attack Korenevo multiple times. However, all of those attacks have been repelled by the Russian forces, preventing them from gaining a foothold. We see that the Ukrainians have moved further along the road towards Korenevo, where they've occupied positions by the forest areas, and this brings us to the sort of operations that the Ukrainians are launching in this section of the front line. The Ukrainians have two units. They have assault units and defensive units. The assault units move in to attack the Russian positions wherever Russian fortified positions are, or if there is a Russian counterattack, whichever it is, they're moving on to face them. They also occupy surrounding villages that are empty to set up ambushes and set up positions ahead of them then driving onwards. The defensive forces of the Ukrainians, the second type of forces, are the ones that follow up to take control of these villages, set up their positions, and occupy those positions. So the first force, their focus is entirely on advancing further, and the second force is entirely focused on holding those advances and consolidating the gains. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainians did not really advance that much on the second day. The reason for that is the Ukrainian forces that were consolidating their gains hadn't finished doing so yet, and therefore the additional advances were separate and far in between, because some of the assault forces still had to occupy some of the positions that they've already taken to prevent a collapse of the front. Therefore, the assault units were not that numerous, and the Russians held back numerous Ukrainian assaults. At the same time, the Ukrainians reached Korenevo, which is one of the strongholds of the Russians. Therefore, the Russian concentration of forces there was strong enough to prevent any Ukrainian breakthrough. At the Suchia direction as well, the Russians were able to hold the line and prevent a Ukrainian advance. However, on the third day of the Ukrainian offensive operations, enough forces has entered to hold the defensive positions, and therefore the assault units were back in motion, and they moved to flank the Russian positions by Suchia, where they've advanced from the northern and northwestern parts of Suchia, both in the direction of the river line here by Luknia and up north, as well as past the Russian fortified positions in the area towards Yushny, which they've captured on the flank of Suchia from the north, and moved all the way to Marchunovka, where fighting is actually taking place right now between Russian and Ukrainian forces. The way that these assault groups advance as much as possible in the shortest time possible is as is shown in this animated video from Rybar, which they recently released. And we see in this video that they pretty much show exactly how these assaults go. Infantry fighting vehicles or armored personnel carriers of the Ukrainians drive up to Russian fortified positions, similar to the Ukrainian summer offensive, where they then start engaging these positions. But at the same time, additional vehicles just drive to nearby villages, nearby populated areas, where they then occupy these positions. They prepare the positions for the defense forces, and then they drive onwards to set up ambushes in case the Russians start launching a counterattack. Here we see an example of such an ambush where the Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle faces off against the Russian one, and the drone is also waiting, hitting it as soon as it arrives. So we see that is exactly how they were doing. An example would be if the Ukrainians drove up to Yushny and then set up ambushes along the road between the northern parts all the way to Suchia, and then the Russian forces arrived through the road to help counterattack, to help send reinforcements to the Russian fortified positions under attack here to the west of Yushny. but instead the Ukrainians are already beyond those fortified positions, setting up ambushes. And that is why communication is very difficult for the Russians, because some defensive units will be saying, we are under attack, we are holding back the Ukrainians, but they are exerting heavy pressure on us, we need reinforcements. The reinforcements arrive just to be ambushed further eastwards beyond the Russian lines. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainians are making a very good use of this strategy to advance further and further. And that means that there are two positions in the Ukrainian advances. There are the forward positions, which are the ones that were most recently captured. And then there's the positions in the rear, which are the old advances. It is clear that the Ukrainians have made use of this tactic to quickly take advantage of the disorganization of the Russians, but this is only a strategy that works here in the early stages. As soon as the Russians establish a front line, then they'll be able to stop such operations from taking place, because then they would be able to rapidly respond to such an operation. What we're currently seeing is that the Russians have yet to establish a front line with the Ukrainians. They have positions in separate areas like Korenevo here to the northwest. They have in Sucha and Martinovka here to the east. They have Legov to the north and several other positions in that direction. So generally there are a lot of Russian positions in the area. These are all going to be moving to the front line to set up a defensive position all around the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk region, and their objective number one priority right now is to establish this front line to prevent further breakthroughs of the Ukrainians, as we have seen in the first 3 days. Up to this point, the Russians have yet to make a single counterattack. We've seen so far that the Ukrainians have been able to continue their offensive operation, where they started out with 1,000 soldiers, and now there are several thousand soldiers. It is not clear exactly how many, but it is approximately 4 Ukrainian brigades involved in the fighting right now. Some Ukrainian sources have claimed a Ukrainian brigade is simply 2,000 soldiers, while others have claimed it's somewhere around 5,000 soldiers. It is probably the 5,000 with both attack forces and logistical forces, where it's about a 50-50 split. So about 2,500 soldiers who are fighting with every brigade. So that's approximately 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers at the front line, both in the assault squads and the defensive forces. The assault squads number about 5,000 to 50% of the units in Kursk region, and the defensive forces is the other 5,000, the other 50%. So based on this, we see that the Ukrainians have a very significant force fighting here in this direction. But here on the 4th day, we see that most of the Russian forces are starting to get in position. We also have reports that Wagner has been involved in the fighting and has started sending their forces towards the Kursk region, where they are fighting the Ukrainians in Martinovka and other sections of the front line here in the Kursk region. So we see that the Russians are starting to establish positions here near the front line, where the objective is to connect these with each other and establish a front line and prevent further Ukrainian breakthroughs. Their current positions have allowed them to prevent further breakthroughs in Korenevo and Sucha. However, the Ukrainians have simply gone around those positions and are flanking them as we speak. So we see that the main push of the Ukrainians are really taking place right now north of Sucha and southeast of Korenevo, where they, in the direction of Korenevo, have not really captured much of anything. They captured Snagost and then a couple of open fields. This is because they were stopped by Korenevo, so now they're going through the southwestern flank to cut off the Russian fortified positions in that direction. Cutting off any supplies to these will allow the Ukrainians to flank those positions and possibly take control of them, which will significantly expand the footholds the Ukrainians have gained on the other side of the border area. The strategy that the Ukrainians are using are very reminiscent of what was used in the Israeli-Palestinian war on the 7th of October, where the soldiers of the Hamas forces moved into Israeli territory and started occupying villages and towns as quickly as possible, while the Israeli military bases were cut off and sieged by the Palestinian forces. They continued moving on to capture as many villages and towns as possible, and then turned to the defensive. The main difference is that the Ukrainians actually have modern equipment and vehicles and so on, which allows them to make as much effective use of this operation as possible. At the same time, the Ukrainians has a large concentration of air defense in the Sumy region, which prevents the Russian Air Force from flying high and effectively using their equipment close to the front. They have to use it far, like they usually do across the other sections of the front line, which reduces their effectiveness considerably. So we see that the Ukrainians have made most use of the tactic and have managed to capture piece after piece, and now are looking at about 400 square kilometers, 450 square kilometers under their control in the Kursk region, and they are slowly pushing beyond the front line to occupy further villages across, flanking the Russian defensive positions, ahead of them establishing a front line. Therefore, we can see that the Ukrainian objective is simply to capture as much territory as possible and then switch to the defensive as soon as they have done so. The more fortified positions they capture, the better. The more territory they capture, the better. The further deep they go, the better. But everything needs to be wide. That means that they don't simply go in one direction all the way to the end. Instead, they will continue advancing on the flanks and continue flanking until their positions are as wide as possible, because that will force the Russians to take as much time as possible to recapture these positions. The objective here is simply to buy time and prevent the Russians from launching their own offensive in the direction. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.